The man who married my former wife 6 weeks after our divorce raised my dead son's challenge coin during his wedding toast. It was not the real coin. I knew because I had ordered the original batch myself. And every one of those coins carried a shallow dent beneath the eagle's right wing. The flaw came from a worn die at a small shop outside Fort Campbell. I had complained about it at the time. The owner offered to remake the whole order. Marianne had said the dent made them honest. The coin in Peter Alden's hand was smooth. That was the first shock. The second was Peter's face. I had last seen it 15 years earlier beneath a different name in a restricted army shipping investigation in Kuwait. His hair had gone silver at the temples. He had lost weight. He had traded contractor boots for polished dress shoes and a navy suit that probably cost more than my first pickup. But bone structure does not retire. Neither does the habit of pressing a thumbnail into the side of his index finger when he is waiting for a reaction. The third shock was the way he looked directly at me while the room applauded. He had not wandered into my family. He had selected it. My name is Warren Holt. I was 59 years old then, an Army Reserve logistics warrant officer with more time behind me than ahead of me, and I had spent most of my adult life accounting for things other people assumed could disappear. Fuel, radios, medical kits, vehicle parts, pallets of food. The Army has a form for nearly every movement of property, but paper alone does not protect anything. People do. They notice when a seal is wrong. They ask why two trucks carry the same serial number. They remember that a missing box does not vanish. It goes somewhere. That habit had saved lives overseas. It had not saved my marriage. I sat at a round table near the rear wall of a restored tobacco barn outside Clarksville, Tennessee, while Peter held up the counterfeit coin and told 100 guests that Eli's memory had brought him and Marianne together. My former wife stood beside him in an ivory dress, one hand resting over his heart. She looked radiant in the way people look when they have decided a new life must be proof that the old one was the problem. Peter spoke about service. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about the Veterans Housing Project he and Marianne planned to build through the Eli Holt Homefront Fund. He said the project would turn grief into shelter. Then he turned the coin once between his fingers and looked at me again, only for a second. Long enough, I felt the old case open inside my memory with the neat violence of a file drawer pulled too hard. A warehouse near Camp Arifian, 2 outbound manifests carrying the same equipment numbers. Restricted thermal sites listed as damaged, then listed again as transferred. A civilian quality manager who called himself Mason Kearney, a cooperating driver who vanished before a scheduled interview. A joint inquiry that narrowed to one shipping network and then went dark when a source was compromised. Peter Alden had been Mason Kearney, or perhaps neither name belonged to him. The case had never become dinner table conversation. It had involved export controls, protected sources, and methods I was still not authorized to discuss. I could report what I had seen through the proper channel. I could not stand in a wedding barn and announce that the groom had once been tied to a classified diversion investigation. There is a difference between warning someone and contaminating a case. There is also a difference between truth and proof. Peter knew that difference. I understood, sitting there, that the invitation had not been an act of grace. The note he had written across the bottom had said that a family should not begin with an empty chair. Marianne had called it mature. I had called it strange. Now I knew what it was. A test. He wanted to see whether I would rise from my seat, point across the room, and make myself look like the jealous soldier who could not accept that his wife had moved on. He wanted me angry. He wanted me loud. He wanted me careless with information that could end my clearance, damage an active inquiry, and hand his future lawyer a clean argument that I had been motivated by revenge. So I did the most difficult thing a man can do when every nerve in him is demanding action. I reached for my water glass. I took one drink, then I applauded with everyone else. Before I tell you why I stayed in that chair, consider what you would have done. The person who had broken your home was walking toward a danger you recognized, but the only warning you could give would violate your duty and help the danger escape. Would you speak anyway? Or would you follow the rules and let the facts build their own case? Leave your answer in the comments. That question followed me longer than the divorce did. Peter lowered the coin and handed the microphone to the band leader. Marianne leaned up and kissed his cheek. The room softened around them. Old friends smiled. Her sister dabbed her eyes. The chairman of the Homefront Fund raised his glass. My daughter Claire sat 2 chairs away from me with her husband, Daniel. She was 34, a certified public accountant who had inherited my preference for clean columns and her mother's refusal to let a bad mood ruin dinner. She watched Peter, then watched me. You recognize him, she said quietly. I kept my eyes on the dance floor. I recognize the coin is wrong. That was not what I asked. It is the answer I can give you. Claire went still. She had grown up around enough military language to hear the locked door inside that sentence. She did not press. Instead, she took a paper napkin from the table, wrote something on it, and slid it toward me. The license plate on his black sport utility vehicle. I glanced down. She had copied the plate while walking in from the parking field. I folded the napkin once and put it in my pocket. That small act mattered later. At the time, it felt like the only thing in the room I was permitted to hold. The first dance began. Peter guided Marianne beneath strands of warm bulbs and dried tobacco beams. He moved well for a man who had once spent most of his days behind shipping containers. He smiled at the right moments. He whispered something that made her laugh. Everyone saw tenderness. I saw control. He kept one hand at the center of her back. He turned her away whenever someone approached from his left. He positioned himself between her and the head table without seeming to. At the end of the song, he folded the printed toast into 3 equal sections, ran his thumbnail along the crease, and slipped it inside his jacket. I had seen that fold before. Old manifests from the Kuwait warehouse had arrived in evidence with the same narrow puncture pressed through the paper near the middle crease. Investigators had thought it came from a damaged clipboard. I had thought it came from a hand. I did not smile. I wanted to, not because Marianne was in danger. There was nothing amusing about that. I wanted to smile because Peter had spent 15 years changing names, businesses, hair, and stories, yet he still folded paper like the same impatient warehouse manager. People imagine professionals erase themselves completely. Most do not. They keep the little movements they stopped noticing years ago. I left before the cake was cut. Peter intercepted me near the barn doors. "Warren," he said. His voice confirmed what his face already had. "Peter," I answered. He held out his hand. I looked at it for half a beat, then shook it. His grip was dry and measured. "Marianne tells me you are a details man." She used to say it with less affection. His smile widened. "I hope we can make peace with the past." I looked at him carefully. Which past would that be? For the first time that evening, the smile failed to reach his eyes. "All of them," he said. Then he stepped aside. I walked through the gravel lot without hurrying. My rental house was 20 minutes away. I made it in 16. Not because I sped, but because every traffic light seemed to understand I had somewhere important to be. I did not call Marianne. I called the duty number for my security office. I gave my name, rank, and the minimum facts required. I said I had encountered an individual I believed matched the subject of a prior restricted investigation. I did not describe the case. I did not speculate about motive. I asked for a secure meeting. The sergeant on duty told me someone would contact me. Then I sat at my kitchen table in the dark with Claire's napkin beside my hand and listened to the refrigerator cycle on and off. That was when I admitted the part I had not wanted to name at the wedding. Peter had copied Eli's coin. To do that, he needed a clear photograph or access to the display case in the Homefront Fund office. Either way, he had studied my son closely enough to manufacture a piece of him. A man does not do that for romance. He does it for leverage. To understand why Peter believed my family could be used against me, you need to understand what was left of that family by the time he arrived. Marianne and I had been married for 36 years. We met at a county fair where she was selling raffle tickets for the public library, and I was home from warrant officer training with a haircut that made my ears look ambitious. She sold me 12 tickets, even though I had only asked for one. I won a pressure cooker. She said it was proof that persistence paid. I said it was proof that raffles were poorly regulated. That was our marriage in miniature. She opened doors. I checked the hinges. Eli used to say his mother left the porch light on, and his father checked the lock twice. We raised 2 children in a brick house north of Clarksville. Claire came first. Eli arrived 3 years later and spent his childhood taking apart anything with screws. He followed me into the army, although he chose medicine because he said somebody in the family should learn how to put things back together. He became a flight medic with the National Guard. 7 years before Peter's wedding, Eli died during a night training exercise when a helicopter went down in bad weather. 5 service members were lost. The investigation found no single dramatic cause. Weather, mechanical strain, terrain, and human decisions had lined up in the wrong order. That answer satisfied the official report. It did not satisfy a mother who had put a plate for her son on the Thanksgiving table for 24 years. Grief did not break Marianne and me all at once. It divided us by method. She needed to say Eli's name. I needed to complete tasks. She gathered his friends at the house. I sorted benefits, paperwork. She cried in the grocery store when she saw his favorite cereal. I repaired the loose railing on the back porch because he had once said he would do it when he came home. Neither of us was wrong. Neither of us knew how to cross the distance. The Eli Holt Homefront Fund began at our dining table. Friends from his unit donated. The church held a supper. A local bank established a scholarship account. Eli's commanding officer sent us his service coin, and I ordered a memorial run based on its design for donors and volunteers. Marianne became executive director because she could make people care without making them feel cornered. I served as board chair for the first 3 years and built the controls. 2 signatures for major transfers. Independent review of related party contracts. Restricted gifts tracked separately. No family member paid for board service. The fund grew beyond anything we expected. A retired construction owner left it a large bequest. A regional hospital committed annual support. By the time Peter entered the picture, the organization held a little more than $2,600,000 across operating reserves, scholarship accounts, and funds restricted for housing. That number matters. Peter needed almost exactly $2 million. I did not know that yet. What I knew was that the fund had become the one place where Marianne and I still worked side by side without speaking about the marriage underneath it. We could sit through a board meeting, approve a rent grant for a veteran family, and drive home in the same car with 10 miles of silence between us. Then my unit mobilized for a logistics mission in Poland. I was gone 7 months. It was not a combat deployment in the way younger soldiers use the word, but it was still a deployment. Long days, cold yards, equipment arriving faster than storage plans, convoys moving across borders under schedules that changed before the ink dried. I slept in a narrow room with a radiator that clanged like an angry cook, and spent most mornings answering questions that began with the phrase, "Sir, we have a problem." Marianne and I spoke every Sunday at first, then every other Sunday, then by text. She told me the foundation had hired a consultant to help develop a housing project. His name was Peter Alden. He ran a nonprofit called Harbor 6 that converted old motels into transitional apartments for veterans. He understood donors. He understood grief. He had been a Navy Seabee, she said, and he knew what it meant to build something useful after loss. I remember reading that message in a warehouse office while sleet tapped the window. I asked whether the board had checked his references. She replied with a thumbs up. That small blue symbol irritated me more than it should have. I wrote back that references were not the same as audited financial statements. She did not answer until the next day. Not everything is an inspection, Warren. I stared at that sentence for a long time. There were several responses available to me. Most would have made the distance worse. I chose the dullest one. Understood. When I returned to Tennessee, Marianne met me at the house wearing a gray sweater I did not recognize. My duffel was still in the entryway when she asked me to sit down. There was no manila folder placed like a weapon. Marianne was not theatrical. She had arranged the documents in a blue portfolio, set 2 cups of coffee beside them, and put a box of tissues near her own chair. That detail told me she expected to cry. She did. I did not. I had done most of my crying for the marriage overseas without giving it that name. It happened in pieces. The Sunday calls that stopped, the family photographs on the foundation website where Peter appeared closer to Marianne in each new image. The message telling me she had attended a veterans gala with him because board members should support one another. The Christmas video where she said she hoped I was staying warm, then glanced towards someone off camera and smiled in a way I had not seen directed at me for years. She told me Peter made her feel present in her own life. She told me she was tired of being married to a man who always returned physically and remained somewhere else. She told me the affair had not become physical until she informed the lawyer she wanted a divorce. I believed the first sentence. I did not spend much time auditing the second. I asked whether Claire knew. Marianne looked down at her coffee. She suspects. I asked whether Peter had access to the fund's accounts. He's a consultant. That was not my question. Her face tightened. This is exactly what I mean. I am telling you our marriage is over, and you are checking account permissions. I looked at the woman I had loved for more than half my life. There were new lines around her mouth. Her hair had more gray in it than when I left. I could see grief, guilt, relief, and anger occupying the same face. I also saw that pressing the financial question then would sound like I cared more about control than loss. So I stopped. We hired separate lawyers. The divorce was not immediate. Papers had been filed while I was overseas, and my attorney made sure my rights under military law were protected before I waived any delay. We divided the house, retirement interests, vehicles, and personal property with less fighting than our friends expected. Marianne kept the house because the foundation office was nearby and because Eli's room was still there. I took my tools, my uniforms, my father's watch, and a small oak desk. I also resigned as board chair. That decision looked generous from the outside. It was partly cowardice. I did not want every future disagreement about the fund to be interpreted as a dispute with my former wife. The board elected a local banker named Howard Pritchard to replace me. He was decent, careful, and too impressed by Peter's vocabulary. I retained no special veto, no secret authority, no private claim on the charity. A nonprofit does not belong to the people who founded it. Its assets belong to its mission. That legal fact would later save what remained. 3 months after I came home, the judge signed the final decree. 6 weeks after that, Marianne married Peter. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope addressed in Peter's handwriting. I knew it was his because he had signed several foundation newsletters while I was away. The note about the empty chair appeared beneath the printed details. Claire called me the same evening. "You are not going," she said. It was not a question. "I think I am." "Why?" "Because he wants me there. That is the best reason not to go. Sometimes..." She was quiet. "Dad, Mom is not thinking clearly. Your mother is an adult. Adults can be manipulated. They can also refuse rescue." Claire exhaled hard enough for me to hear it through the phone. "That sounds like something you say when you are hurt and want it to sound like policy." She was right. I did not tell her that. The week before the wedding, Marianne sent a group photograph from a foundation dinner. Peter stood beside her with one hand at her waist. His face was turned partly away. The resolution was poor. I felt recognition stir, but grief and suspicion can make strangers familiar. I would not accuse a man based on the angle of a jaw in a compressed photograph. What caught my attention was the coin pinned inside a display case behind them. The fund's original memorial coin was supposed to be in that case. At the wedding, Peter held up a copy. That meant he had either removed the original and replaced it, or he had photographed it closely enough to commission a replica. The distinction was important. The intent was worse. By midnight after the wedding, I had written down everything I could remember. Peter's claim name, his vehicle plate, the false coin, the threefold paper habit, the words he used at the door. Which past would that be? All of them. I did not write that he was guilty. Logistics teaches you to separate observation from conclusion. Observation was that Peter resembled Mason Kearney. Conclusion was that he had engineered his way into my family. The first could be reported, the second had to be proved. The call from the security office came before sunrise. I met a special agent named Dana Bishop in a secure room on post later that morning. Dana had worked the old Kuwait inquiry as a young investigator. 15 years had added silver to her hair and removed any patience she might once have had for unnecessary conversation. She placed a blank legal pad between us. "Tell me only what happened in Tennessee," she said. "Do not fill gaps with what you remember from Kuwait unless I ask inside the authorized scope." I described the wedding. When I said Peter had folded his toast into thirds and pressed his thumbnail through the crease, Dana stopped writing. "Show me." I folded a spare sheet. The old motion was not mine, so I used the end of a pen to mark the puncture. She leaned back. "Did he recognize you? He used my name. He referred to all of our pasts. That is not enough to establish knowledge." "No, but it is enough to make me ask why he copied my son's coin." Dana's expression changed then. Investigators learn to protect their faces, but no training removes the human response entirely. She asked for the plate number. I gave her Claire's napkin inside a clear document sleeve. I had handled it only by the corners after taking it from my pocket. That was excessive for a license plate written on a wedding napkin. It was also who I was. Dana almost smiled. Still making evidence out of trash. Still finding evidence where people leave it. She slid the sleeve into a folder. "The old matter remains restricted," she said. "Some portions are tied to an active counterintelligence concern. You may report contact with the subject. You may preserve lawfully available information. You may not disclose protected identities, collection methods, or classified facts to Marianne, Claire, or anyone else without authorization." Can I tell Marianne he may be dangerous? Dangerous how? That was the trap inside the question. A vague warning without support would be dismissed as jealousy. A specific warning would require facts I could not share. Dana saw me understand. "You can tell any person to conduct due diligence," she said. "You cannot use restricted information to support the warning. Do not confront him. Do not access accounts or records without permission. Do not follow him. Do not manufacture contact. If he reaches out, document it. Is this case active because of him? I cannot answer that here." Which was an answer of its own. Before I left, Dana said one more thing. "Silence is not the same as inaction. Warren, use the channel. Let us do our job." That sentence became the rail I held for the next several months. The Kuwait case had begun with a discrepancy so small, most people would have corrected it and moved on. A pallet of thermal sites arrived at a redistribution warehouse with a seal number that did not match the advance shipping notice. The receiving clerk assumed someone had transposed 2 characters. I asked him to leave the entry untouched until we traced the source document. The second document listed the same serial range on equipment supposedly destroyed after a vehicle fire. One set of sites cannot be both delivered and destroyed. That was the first hard fact. We traced the paperwork through a civilian quality control office, managed by a contractor called Mason Kearney. He was competent, charming, and helpful in exactly the way a man is helpful when he wants to direct your attention. He offered replacement records before we requested them. He knew which junior employees had made mistakes. He always had an explanation, prepared one step ahead of the question. What he did not know was that I kept a red grease pencil in my pocket. Electronic systems were useful, but convoy yards did not always respect electronics. I marked suspect entries on printed manifests with a short red line beside the item number. When revised copies returned, the line moved with the item even though the page had supposedly been regenerated from the system. Someone was copying the old sheet, altering selected fields, and presenting it as new. The copied red mark connected the false documents. Mason Kearney's 3-fold crease connected them to his office. Investigators later linked the shipments to a network that diverted restricted equipment through shell carriers and false damage claims. The amount of money was serious. The national security concern was worse. A cooperating driver agreed to identify the men who changed seals before outbound convoys. Then his name leaked. He disappeared. The source network shut down. Several arrests were made on ordinary fraud charges, but the central figures scattered before the larger case could be built. Mason Kearney vanished. The inquiry remained open in the way some inquiries do. Not active enough to make headlines. Not dead enough to discuss. I returned to normal logistics work and signed documents reminding me that classified information did not become mine simply because I had helped uncover it. For years, the case became a private lesson. People assume theft announces itself with an empty room. Most theft begins with a duplicate entry. The system says the same item exists in 2 places. Everyone chooses the location they prefer. By the time someone checks the shelf, the truck is across a border. Peter was using the same method with people. To Marianne, he was a patient man who understood loss. To donors, he was a builder who understood veterans. To the foundation board, he was a consultant who understood federal grants. To me, he was a former contractor who understood exactly how much uncertainty could fit between a fact and an accusation. Each version could exist long enough for him to move what he wanted. I drove home from the secure meeting and considered calling Marianne anyway. Duty is simple when it costs only comfort. It becomes harder when it asks you to watch someone you loved move toward harm. There was also an uglier truth. Marianne had spent years believing my caution was a kind of emotional defect. When I checked the roof contractor's insurance before he began work, she said I embarrassed him. When I refused to invest in a neighbor's equipment lease because the returns made no sense, she said I assumed every handshake concealed a knife. The contractor later abandoned 3 jobs. The equipment lease collapsed within a year. Being correct did not make me easier to live with. I had a habit of presenting conclusions after I had already built the case in my head. Marianne experienced the warning without seeing the steps. To her, I was not careful. I was controlling. After Eli died, that difference became a canyon. She wanted faith in people because faith kept her connected to the world. I wanted documentation because documentation kept the world from taking anything else. Peter offered her certainty without caution. He did not tell her to inspect the bridge. He told her he would carry her across it. If I had called the morning after the wedding and said Peter was not what he seemed, she would have heard a former husband trying to reclaim authority. Peter had prepared that interpretation before I ever opened my mouth. The counterfeit coin proved it. He wanted a reaction. I decided not to give him one. Instead, I began with information any citizen could obtain. The Homefront Fund was tax-exempt. Federal law required it to make its 3 most recent annual information returns available for public inspection. I downloaded every filing. I reviewed state charity registrations. I searched county property records, business registrations, civil lawsuits, and public federal award data. I used my own computer. I paid ordinary copy fees. I did not open a single file that required someone else's password. Claire helped only after I explained the boundary. Public records, I told her. Nothing from your mother's email, nothing from the foundation system unless the board gives written authorization. You think Peter is stealing? I think the controls are changing faster than the mission. That is not an answer. It is the answer I can support. She rubbed both hands over her face. You military people could make a fire alarm sound classified. I laughed despite myself. That was the first time I had laughed since the divorce. Our initial review found nothing criminal. That was almost reassuring. Harbor 6 had filed annual returns. Peter's compensation was high, but not absurd. The nonprofit reported renovations in 3 states. Its website displayed veterans holding apartment keys beside fresh paint and donated furniture. The photographs looked real because most of them were real. A good fraud does not fabricate everything. It borrows truth. Then, Claire found the first duplicate. Harbor 6 had paid a company called Cedar Crown Development for project management. The Eli Holt Homefront Fund had hired the same company to conduct a feasibility study in Tennessee. Different project, different year, same invoice description, same unusual spelling error in the phrase environmental assessment, same total amount, down to the last dollar. Claire placed both pages on my oak desk. Could be a template, she said. Could be. Could be lazy billing. Could be. Could be. Fraud. Could be. She looked at me. You are enjoying this. No, I am trying not to. That was mostly true. We sent the documents to Dana through the approved channel. 3 days later, Peter called me. Peter invited me to lunch as if we were 2 reasonable men settling a property line. We met at a diner near the interstate. He arrived early and chose a booth facing the door. Former military people do that. So do men who want you to think they were military. He wore a Harbor 6 polo shirt and the expression of someone prepared to forgive me. Marianne says you have concerns about the housing project, he began. Marianne and I have not discussed the project. Claire asked questions. She is an accountant? She is also your daughter. Both statements are true. He stirred his coffee even though he had not added sugar. I know divorce can make ordinary governance feel personal, he said. I want you to know I am not replacing Eli. I am trying to honor him, then use the real coin. The spoon stopped against the cup, only for an instant. I continued. The one you held at the wedding was a replica. Peter smiled again. We had copies made for donors. The board never approved copies. Not every kind gesture requires emotion. At the old Kuwait warehouse, Mason Kearney had used the phrase, not every correction requires a report. Peter watched me over the rim of his cup. I let the silence sit. He placed the spoon on the saucer, folded his paper napkin into 3 sections, and pressed his thumbnail along the crease. Then he said, You always did care about serial numbers. There it was. Not a confession. Not a threat. A needle pushed through 15 years of sealed history. I did not ask what he meant. I took cash from my wallet, covered my coffee, and stood. Peter looked almost disappointed. Please tell Marianne I wish her well, I said. You can tell her yourself. Not about this. His eyes hardened. That sounds lonely, Warren. It was meant to. I drove directly to the security office and wrote the conversation from memory before speaking to anyone. Dana recorded a formal statement. She asked whether Peter had named Kuwait, the equipment, the old alias, or any protected fact. No. Then he is still testing the fence, she said. Why? We are working on that. Can you protect Marianne? We can investigate crimes. We cannot place a guard around every bad decision. I did not like the answer. It was still true. Over the next 4 months, Peter moved faster. He called the proposed housing development Eli's Landing. The plan showed 32 small apartments, a counseling office, a workshop, and a community kitchen on 28 acres Marianne had inherited from her father. The renderings were handsome. Brick porches, broad sidewalks, flags at every entrance. A place designed to look like safety before a shovel touched soil. The fund announced a capital campaign. Peter joined the board as chief development officer without salary for the first year, which donors admired. He said his compensation would come later when the project produced management revenue. Howard Pritchard, the board chair, described the arrangement as selfless. Claire described it as deferred. Peter persuaded the board to move 2 independent directors into advisory roles. He replaced them with a real estate broker who had worked on Harbor 6 properties and a minister whose church received renovation work from Cedar Crown Development. Neither relationship appeared in the meeting summary posted online. Related parties are not automatically corrupt. Undisclosed related parties are smoke. The public filings showed more smoke. Cedar Crown registered a new Tennessee company called Landing Management Partners. Its mailing address was a commercial box. The registered organizer was an attorney in Nashville who had formed dozens of companies and would not identify clients without legal process. Landing Management then filed a financing statement covering construction equipment the Homefront Fund had not yet purchased. A financing statement does not prove a debt exists. It gives notice that a lender claims an interest in certain collateral. The listed collateral included modular housing units, generators, vehicles, and all proceeds arising from the Eli's Landing project. Claire read the description twice. They pledged equipment they do not own, or they plan to move ownership before anyone notices. Can they do that? They can file paper. Whether the paper is valid is another question. We sent it to Dana. Marianne stopped returning Claire's calls for several days after that. When she finally answered, she accused her of helping me undermine the project. Peter says Dad is contacting donors. Is he? No. Then why would Peter say it? Because he wants you to deny it instead of asking what he is doing. Claire told me the conversation ended there. A week later, Marianne appeared at my rental house carrying a covered casserole dish she had not visited since I moved in. The dish contained chicken and rice, the meal she had made whenever I returned from the field during the first half of our marriage. I invited her inside. She looked around the small living room. One sofa, one chair, books stacked on a crate because I had not bought shelves. Eli's folded flag on the mantel, my oak desk near the window. You could make this place less temporary, she said. It is not temporary. She nodded as if that answer had closed the door she had hoped remained cracked. We ate at the kitchen table for 10 minutes. She discussed Claire's work, her sister's knee replacement, and a leak at the old house. Then she placed her fork down. Are you investigating Peter? No. Claire says you are pulling records. Public records. Why? Because the foundation is changing its controls. It has to grow. Growth does not require hidden relationships. Her face flushed. There it is. The accusation without the courage to say it plainly. I did not answer. She leaned forward. Peter believes you resent that he is finishing the work you abandoned. I resigned from a board. I did not abandon Eli. I knew the moment the words left me that they would cut. Marianne stood so quickly, her chair scraped the floor. You abandoned every conversation that did not come with a checklist, she said. Peter was there when I spoke about our son. He did not fix the railing. He sat with me. I stood too. And what did sitting cost? Her eyes filled. You cannot help yourself. No. I said, that is the problem. I spent 36 years believing help meant preventing every mistake. I am trying to learn the difference between help and control. She looked at me for a long time. Then tell me one thing. Is Peter dangerous? The truthful answer divided into two parts. What I knew, through restricted information. What I could prove in public. I chose my words carefully. I believe the foundation should suspend his financial authority until an independent review is complete. That is not what I asked. It is what I can support. Her expression closed. Peter said you would do this. He said you would hide behind procedure because you cannot bear to see me trust someone else. She picked up the casserole dish and left. I watched her car pull away. Then I sat at the table and admitted something I had avoided. The rules were protecting the investigation. They were also protecting me from the possibility that Marianne might hear the warning and choose Peter anyway. Duty and fear can wear the same uniform. You have to inspect both. 2 days later, Dana called me into another secure meeting. She had enough authorization to tell me 3 things. First, Peter Alden was not a Navy veteran. There was no service record under that name, and the personal history he gave donors was false. Second, Harbor 6 had been notified that nearly $1,900,000 in claimed project costs could be disallowed after a federal grant review. The organization had a short period to document the expenses or repay the money. Cedar Crown had received most of the questionable payments. Third, 6 months before Peter first met Marianne, Cedar Crown had paid a private investigator for a background package on me, my former wife Claire, and the Eli Holt Homefront Fund. Dana let that last fact settle. He researched us before he met her. Yes. Why was my service history valuable to him? We are not certain. I am. She waited. He knows who I was in Kuwait. He needs money, but money is not the only target. He wants me to react. Dana closed the folder in front of her. That is our working assessment. What does he think I have? Possibly a copy of a discrepancy ledger from the warehouse. Possibly knowledge that could identify a protected source. Possibly nothing. People who build their lives on hidden records tend to believe everyone else hides records too. I had no ledger. The red grease pencil had marked working copies that went into official evidence. I had kept no classified paper, no private duplicate, no souvenir from the case. Peter had built part of his plan around a document that did not exist, but the money did exist. The Homefront Fund held enough unrestricted reserve to cover most of Harbor 6's problem. The housing project offered a lawful-looking reason to move that reserve into related construction companies. Marriage gave Peter access to Marianne's trust. His role gave him access to the mission. My history gave him a second objective. He could steal the fund. He could search the old house for evidence he imagined I had left behind. And if he could provoke me into a public accusation based on restricted information, he could portray the old case as the obsession of a bitter former husband. He might damage my usefulness as a witness. He might force a dispute over classified discovery. At minimum, he would learn how much I knew. The wedding had been reconnaissance. My family had been terrain. Once I knew the family had been chosen, anger became almost useful. Almost. Anger gives energy. It does not give judgment. I had spent enough years around young soldiers to know the difference. A furious person can move quickly in the wrong direction and call the speed progress. Dana's team needed evidence of present crimes, not merely an old face and a bad motive. The Federal Grant Review gave them a reason to examine Harbor 6. It did not prove Peter had touched the Homefront Fund. The background report showed planning. It did not show theft. So we waited for facts. Peter gave us many. Landing management partners submitted a proposal to oversee Eli's landing for a fee equal to nearly 1/4 of the project's construction budget. Cedar Crown would provide materials. Harbor 6 would provide resident services. Peter sat on all three sides of the arrangement while telling donors he had waived compensation. The posted board minutes described the relationships as strategic partnerships. They did not disclose common control. Claire and I built a chart from public records. Company names in one column, addresses in another. Officers, agents, lenders, and payments in the rest. Red lines connected repeated details. The commercial box used by landing management had also appeared on a Cedar Crown insurance certificate. A Harbor 6 director owned the warehouse where project materials were supposedly stored. A lender's mailing address matched the private investigator who had researched my family. By the time we finished, the chart looked like a roadmap drawn by someone trying to avoid every main road. Dana accepted the package without praising it. Good investigators do not praise evidence. They test it. Marianne, meanwhile, moved farther from the people who questioned Peter. She stopped attending church with her sister. She told Claire that family negativity was threatening the Capitol campaign. She removed Howard Pritchard as board chair after he asked for an independent construction estimate. Peter arranged for Howard to receive a plaque thanking him for years of service. That was Peter's style. He wrapped exclusion in ceremony. The new board approved a bridge financing plan. The fund would place its unrestricted reserve into an account controlled jointly with landing management. The money would demonstrate liquidity to a private lender. Peter described the transfer as temporary. Once the federal housing award arrived, the reserve would return with interest. Temporary is one of the most expensive words in finance. The board meeting summary showed unanimous approval. Howard called me the next morning. "I did not vote for that," he said. "I was still chair on the date listed. Do you have your meeting packet? Every page. Do not write on it. Do not reorganize it. Put it somewhere safe and call a lawyer." He did. The minutes attached to the financing resolution bore Howard's electronic signature. He said he had never seen them. Near the center fold of the printed copy was a tiny puncture. Claire noticed it first. 3 folds, she said. I used my red pencil to place a small line beside the hole. We sent a scan to Dana and the original through counsel. Still, the transfer had not happened. Peter needed Marianne's signature because the fund's bank had kept an old control, requiring the executive director and 1 independent officer for any movement above a set threshold. Peter had replaced the independent officer on paper, but the bank's records had not been updated. He told Marianne the form was routine, she might have signed it, she nearly did. The thing that stopped her was not my warning, Claire's chart, or a federal agent. It was a blue binder. Marianne had kept a physical binder for the Homefront Fund since its first church supper. Donor letters, thank you notes, copies of restricted gift agreements, photographs of veterans the fund had helped, Eli's obituary, the receipt from the coin maker. The binder had expanded into 3 binders over the years, all blue because that was the color of the first one. Peter disliked them. He called them clutter. He said professional organizations used cloud storage. He arranged for an intern to scan the contents and schedule the shredding service. Marianne canceled the shredding pickup. She told him the papers were part of the fund's memory. He laughed and said memory did not pass an audit. That sentence bothered her. Eli had once said almost the opposite. During medic training, he told her that paperwork mattered because memory changed under stress. Marianne had repeated the story at fundraising dinners. Peter had heard it more than once. Yet, he wanted the originals gone. The night before the bank appointment, Marianne opened the oldest binder. She later told me she was not looking for evidence, She wanted to remind herself why the fund existed before committing its reserve to a project that suddenly felt too large to understand. She found the original board resolution on major transfers. She found donor agreements restricting hundreds of thousands of dollars to scholarships and emergency housing assistance. Those funds could not simply be used as proof of liquidity for a construction company. She found the receipt for Eli's challenge coins. Taped beside it was the authentic memorial coin, the one with the dent beneath the eagle's wing. Marianne had removed it from the display case months before the wedding after a child bumped the cabinet during an event. She planned to reinstall it after the latch was repaired. Peter did not know she had moved it. The coin he raised at the wedding had not been a replacement made for convenience. He had created it from a photograph. At the back of the binder, Marianne found a copy of a board consent bearing her signature. It authorized landing management to draw on the reserve if construction costs exceeded estimates. The signature looked like hers. The date did not. On that date, she had been in Louisville with Claire for a medical appointment. The supposed notary worked at an office in Nashville. Marianne called Claire just after midnight. Claire drove to the house and photographed every page before touching anything else. Then she placed the binders in separate clean boxes and called an attorney named Evelyn Shaw, who had advised the fund during its formation. Evelyn arrived before dawn in sweatpants under a wool coat. She read the transfer documents at Marianne's kitchen table. "A spouse can share a home and a bank account," she said. "A charitable officer cannot turn restricted donations into marital property. Those dollars belong to the purpose promised to the donors." Marianne asked whether Peter could move the money without her. Evelyn said the forged consent suggested he intended to try. They contacted the bank when it opened. The compliance officer, Marcus Lee, met them in a private room. He explained that federal law prevented him from confirming whether the bank had filed a suspicious activity report or even whether one existed. He could discuss the underlying transactions. He could receive a written fraud affidavit. He could preserve records and respond to lawful requests from investigators. Marianne signed the affidavit. The bank placed internal restrictions on the pending transfer while counsel sought a court order and law enforcement completed its process. Only then did Claire call me. "Mom wants you here," she said. "Does she know what I can and cannot tell her?" "She knows Peter forged her name." That changes the conversation. It changes everything. I drove to the old house in rain heavy enough to blur the road. Peter was in Nashville, supposedly meeting the lender. Marianne sat at the dining table where we had built the foundation and where, years later, she had told me our marriage was over. The 3 blue binders stood in front of her. The real challenge coin rested on the wood between us. She looked smaller than she had at the wedding, not weak, reduced by the sudden removal of a story she had been living inside. "How long?" she asked. I sat across from her. "How long what? How long have you known he was lying?" I knew at the wedding that his identity was connected to a restricted investigation. I reported it the same night. Her eyes closed. "You knew." "I knew enough to report. Not enough to accuse in public. You let me stay with him. I did not have the authority to remove you from your own life. I was your wife for 36 years. Former wife," I said, then regretted the precision. She flinched. I softened my voice. "Marianne, I could not disclose classified information. I also believe the warning from me would drive you closer to him. He designed it that way." "You could have tried." "Yes." The word surprised both of us. "I could have tried harder, within the limits. I could have told you more plainly that the fund needed an independent review. I did tell myself the rules made every other choice impossible. That was not entirely true." She looked at me through tears. "Were you punishing me?" I answered slowly. Part of me was tired of being asked to protect people who treated protection like an insult. That part was not noble. But I did not stay silent to make this happen. I reported him. I preserved what I could. I waited because an accusation would have helped him, and because the evidence had to survive us. Marianne turned the coin beneath her fingers until the dent caught the light. "He made a copy to make you react." "Yes." "Why?" "Because he did not marry you only for the fund." I told her what Dana had authorized me to disclose. Peter had researched the family before meeting her. His prior organization faced a repayment problem close to the amount held in the Homefront Reserve. He believed I might possess evidence from an old case. He wanted money, access, and a public mistake from me. Marianne listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked toward the hallway that led to Eli's old room. "He studied my grief," she said. "Yes. And I called it love." I had no useful answer. Evelyn did. She closed the blue binder. "Then we stopped discussing what he called it," she said. "We document what he did." Peter returned from Nashville that afternoon. Marianne did not confront him at home. Evelyn had advised her to keep distance, preserve messages, and avoid any conversation that might cause him to destroy records. Claire stayed with her overnight. I slept in my truck outside the old house because Peter still had a key and because no one involved wanted me under the same roof if he appeared. He did not. He sent Marianne 6 messages. The first asked whether she had signed the bank form. The second reminded her that the lender's deadline was noon. The third said delay would embarrass them in front of donors. The fourth said trust was the foundation of marriage. The fifth accused Claire of poisoning her against him. The sixth said he had called an emergency board meeting for the following morning at the home front office. Marianne showed me the screen through the truck window. He always makes doubt sound like betrayal, she said. That is how he moves the burden. You ask about a document. He makes you defend your love. I did that to you too. Not like this. Sometimes. Rain ticked against the roof of the truck. We had spent years simplifying one another into roles. I was the suspicious husband. She was the trusting wife. Peter had studied those roles and turned them into handles. The next morning, the home front office smelled of old coffee and fresh printer toner. It occupied a converted insurance agency with a reception area, 2 offices, and a conference room where photographs of Eli hung beside letters from veterans the fund had helped. Dana and 2 other agents waited in the rear office with legal authority I did not ask to see. Evelyn had coordinated the meeting. The bank had preserved the pending transfer request. A judge had approved warrants based on the forged documents, related company records, grant evidence, and the older investigation. My role was limited. Observe. Answer only what Dana had cleared. Do not provoke. Peter arrived carrying a leather case and wearing the silver bridge tie bar from the wedding. He stopped when he saw me seated beside Claire. What is he doing here? He asked Marianne. She sat at the head of the table with a blue binder in front of her. He is Eli's father. Peter set the case down. He is not on the board, neither are you, Evelyn said, until the validity of your appointment is resolved. Peter looked at her, then at the binder. The first layer fell when Marianne placed both coins on the table. The real one showed its small dent beneath the wing. The replica shone beside it. You told the wedding guests you carried Eli's coin, she said. I said it represented his legacy. You had this copy made before you had access to the original. It was a symbolic gift. It was bait. Peter's eyes moved to me. For the first time, he looked less like a husband and more like the warehouse manager I remembered. Not frightened, calculating. He opened the leather case and removed a stack of papers. We can discuss hurt feelings after the bridge financing closes, he said. If the reserve is not verified today, the project loses its lender, and the fund loses its federal opportunity. The second layer fell when Evelyn slid the fraud affidavit across the table. The transfer is suspended, she said. On whose authority? The bank's controls, the executive director's affidavit, and a court order. You are destroying a housing project over a clerical error. A forged signature is not clerical. Peter picked up the affidavit, folded it into 3 equal sections, and pressed his thumbnail through the center. Claire looked at me. I did not need to mark that page with red pencil. Everyone at the table saw it. Peter realized the movement too late. He set the paper down flat. Marianne opened the binder to the original donor restrictions. These accounts cannot be pledged to your company, she said. Our company? No. The fund's mission is not marital property. His voice sharpened. You do not understand the financing. I understand. My name was forged. He changed direction then. Good manipulators do not keep pushing a locked door. They find another entrance. Peter's shoulders lowered. His face softened. Marianne, he said. I was trying to protect the project from Warren's interference. He has been digging through our life since the wedding. He cannot stand that you chose a man who shows up. I felt the old temptation rise. Defend yourself. List the facts. Win the room. I let Marianne answer. A man who shows up does not need 3 names, she said. That was the third layer. Dana had authorized Evelyn to disclose the alias in the presence of counsel because the warrants were ready and the subject would be taken into custody. Peter looked toward the rear hallway. Mason Kearney, Evelyn said. That was one of them. Peter's face became empty. Warren filled your head with classified stories. Warren told me almost nothing. That seemed to unsettle him more than an accusation would have. He turned to me. Where is the ledger? There it was. The object he had researched my family to find. The document he imagined I had stolen from an army case and hidden somewhere in the old house. There is no ledger, I said. You marked the shipments. On official working copies, you kept records. The government kept evidence. I kept my oath. Peter stared at me. All those months, he said. I put the coin in your hand. I gave you my face. I brought you into the room, and you did nothing. I reported you before the wedding cake was cut. His expression cracked. Not much, just enough. The fourth layer arrived from the rear office. Dana entered with the other agents. She identified herself and told Peter to keep his hands visible. One agent moved the leather case away, another secured his phone and laptop under the warrant. Peter did not resist. Men like him often believe resistance is a failure of vocabulary. He had talked his way through doors for years. Even then, he searched for the sentence that would turn the room. He found Marianne's wound. He looked at her while Dana placed him under arrest. "Ask him," Peter said. "Ask Warren how long he watched you sleep beside a man he believed was a criminal." Marianne's face lost color. Peter continued. "He knew at the altar. He knew when you signed the project papers. He knew when you defended me to your daughter. He let you make a fool of yourself because silence was the only revenge he had left." Dana told him to stop speaking. He smiled. That was what he had wanted from the beginning. Not merely money, not merely an old ledger. He wanted his arrest, if it came, to leave a charge behind in my family. Marianne turned to me. Was any part of this revenge? The room went quiet. I could have answered no and defended the cleaner version of myself. Instead, I gave her the truth. "Part of me wanted you to learn that my caution was not contempt," I said. "Part of me was relieved that I no longer had to force you to believe me. But I did not let him steal from Eli to punish you. I reported him. I followed the evidence. I am here now because protecting the fund matters, and because you matter as Claire's mother, even though our marriage is over." Peter laughed once. "You hear that? He still needs you to know it is over." I looked at Marianne, not him. "Helping you is not a promise to return," I said. "It is a refusal to let him decide what kind of people we become after what he did." Marianne covered her mouth and began to cry. Not the soft tears she had shed over divorce papers. These came from lower down. Grief for Peter, shame for believing him, anger at me, anger at herself. Fresh grief for Eli, whose name had been used as a tool. I moved toward her, then stopped. For most of our marriage, I had assumed care meant taking control before she could ask. This time I waited. Marianne reached across the table. I took her hand, only her hand. If you have ever had to help someone who once chose not to trust you, leave a word in the comments for the person facing that choice now. Being right does not tell you what mercy should cost. Sometimes the hardest boundary is the one that lets you offer help without offering your life back. Dana led Peter toward the door. He paused beside the wall of photographs. In one, Eli stood in uniform with his medic bag over one shoulder, smiling at something outside the frame. Peter looked at the picture, then at me. "You think this ends with me?" he said. "No," I answered. "I think it begins with the records." The agents took him outside. His polished shoes crossed the same threshold veterans had crossed when asking for rent assistance, counseling, or a place to sleep. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Marianne released my hand. "What happens now?" she asked. Evelyn closed the leather case the agents had emptied. "Now," she said, "we count what is left." Counting what remained took months. The first inventory was financial. Peter had not emptied the fund, but he had moved enough to hurt it. Payments to Cedar Crown and Landing Management totaled a little more than $600,000. Some had purchased legitimate surveys, site work, and architectural plans. Much had been billed twice, inflated, or routed through companies that performed no visible service. The pending reserve transfer would have moved more than $2 million beyond the fund's direct control. Marianne's midnight review stopped it. The bank recovered part of an earlier payment from an escrow account. Investigators seized funds from Cedar Crown. Insurance eventually covered a portion of the forged disbursements. After legal fees and losses, the Homefront fund was down several $100,000, not destroyed. That distinction mattered to the veterans whose rent checks still had to clear, while adults argued about betrayal. The second inventory was documentary. The agents searched the foundation office, Peter's Nashville workspace, the old house, and a storage unit leased through Cedar Crown. Claire's wedding napkin helped connect the black vehicle to that lease. Inside the unit, investigators found company seals, blank notary forms, donor lists, false service records, and files on several Gold Star families. My family had not been his first research project. We had been the most useful one. The real name eventually attached to Peter was Malcolm Vey. It had belonged to him before: Mason Kearney, Peter Alden, and two other identities investigators tied to construction and charity work. He was not a veteran. He had been a civilian logistics employee on overseas contract, close enough to military life to learn the vocabulary, and far enough outside it to reinvent his service whenever convenient. The old Kuwait inquiry reopened around records found in the storage unit. Some evidence had aged beyond use. Some witnesses were gone. But money trails last longer than people expect, especially when the same man keeps hiring companies that share addresses, officers, and habits. Harbor 6 collapsed under the Grant review. Former employees began talking. One admitted Peter had ordered costs moved between projects to satisfy auditors. Another produced messages directing staff to copy invoice descriptions from completed work. A notary acknowledged that her stamp had been taken from an unlocked desk. Federal charges followed, including wire fraud, money laundering, aggravated identity theft, and offenses tied to the diversion scheme overseas. State authorities pursued the forged charitable records and theft allegations. I was not present when Malcolm entered his plea. Dana told me later that he admitted enough to avoid a trial on some counts while contesting others. He never admitted choosing Marianne to hurt me. He did not need to. The background invoice, the counterfeit coin, the question about the ledger, and his own words in the conference room formed a sequence clearer than any confession. I testified before a grand jury and later at a sentencing hearing after the necessary parts of the old case were cleared for use. I described duplicate serial numbers, copied red marks, and the threefold puncture. I kept my answers narrow. Training carried me through until a prosecutor placed a photograph of the home front office on a screen. Eli's face appeared behind the conference table. For a moment, I could not speak. The judge waited. So did everyone else. I had believed discipline meant emotion should never interrupt the work. At 59, I finally understood that discipline sometimes means returning to the sentence after emotion has had its honest moment. I asked for water. Then I finished. Marianne resigned as executive director before the board could decide whether to request it. She had not participated in Peter's fraud, but she had bypassed controls, hidden a personal relationship from parts of the board, and treated questions as disloyalty. Good intentions did not erase governance failures. She said that herself at the annual meeting. I trusted a man more than the safeguards we built, she told donors. I confused his confidence with competence and his attention with character. The fund survived because other people kept records when I wanted reassurance. Some donors left. Others stayed because the admission was specific. Howard Pritchard returned as interim chair. Evelyn rewrote the conflict policy. No officer could approve a contract involving a spouse, household member, business partner, or recent employer. Large transfers required independent board review and direct bank confirmation. Original records were scanned, indexed, and retained under a formal schedule rather than handed to a shredder because someone preferred tidy shelves. Claire joined the finance committee for 1 year, then stepped away so the fund would not become a Holt family possession in practice after surviving the same mistake in theory. I did not rejoin the board. That surprised Marianne. We met at a quiet restaurant several months after Peter's arrest. She looked steadier. Her hair was shorter. She wore no wedding ring. The case is asking for your experience, she said. The board has experience, not like yours. That was the old invitation. Become necessary. Call it love. I shook my head. Eli's mission should not depend on either of us being irreplaceable. She looked down at her hands. I owe you an apology. Several. A faint smile moved across her face. Still keeping count. Only when invited. She apologized for the affair, for dismissing my warning, for allowing Peter to turn my caution into proof of jealousy, and for repeating private criticisms of me that helped him understand where to press. I apologized for making vigilance the only language I offered during our grief. I told her I had often used correctness to avoid vulnerability. I admitted that after the wedding, a wounded part of me had taken satisfaction in being the only person who understood the danger. Marianne listened. Then she asked whether there was any path back to our marriage. I had expected the question. The answer still hurt. No. She nodded, but tears gathered. Because of Peter. Because we were ending before Peter arrived. He found the crack. He did not create all of it. Could we build something different? We already are. She waited for more. I gave it to her. We can be Claire's parents. We can honor Eli. We can speak honestly when honesty is ours to share. But I will not return to a marriage where rescue and resentment keep trading uniforms. Marianne wiped her eyes with the corner of her napkin. That sounds rehearsed. I had a long drive. She laughed then. A real laugh. Tired. Sad. Familiar. It did not mean we belonged together. It meant not every good thing had to be recovered in its original form. I retired from the Army Reserve the following spring. At the ceremony, a young chief warrant officer presented me with a framed red grease pencil. Someone had mounted it beneath a brass plate that read, in words rather than numbers, account for what matters. The phrase embarrassed me. I kept it anyway. Retirement was quieter than deployment and louder than I expected. Without a formation, a duty phone, or a problem waiting in a motor pool, a man can hear the parts of himself he assigned to later. I bought shelves for the rental house. Then I bought the house. I began meeting a counselor at the Veterans Clinic once a month. I did not advertise that fact to my old unit, but I stopped hiding it too. Grief had sat in my chest for 7 years, wearing the name responsibility. Naming it did not remove it. It gave it a chair instead of letting it pace the whole house. Claire and I still reviewed tax returns together sometimes, although mostly for charities she was considering supporting. She would circle a related party transaction and ask what I saw. I would tell her, then she would ask what else it might mean. That second question was her gift to me. A duplicate can prove fraud. It can also prove a clerk copied a line. Good judgment does not lower suspicion. It keeps suspicion from becoming vanity. 2 years after the wedding, Eli's Landing opened on a smaller plan. There were 8 cottages instead of 32 apartments. The counseling office occupied a renovated farmhouse already standing on the property. Volunteers built raised garden beds. A local union donated labor for the workshop. The project carried no management contract with Harbor 6, no private lender demanding control, and no promise that growth would solve every problem. It opened debt-free. The morning of the dedication was cold and bright. Veterans, donors, neighbors, and members of Eli's old unit gathered beneath a white tent. Howard spoke briefly. Evelyn spoke even more briefly, which everyone appreciated. Claire presented a one-page financial summary large enough for people in the back row to read. Marianne stood near the entrance wearing the blue coat she had worn to Eli's graduation from medic training. She was no longer an officer of the fund. She volunteered twice a week, mostly answering calls from families who did not know which form to complete or how to ask for help without apologizing. The blue binders sat inside a glass cabinet in the farmhouse office, not as sacred objects, as records. The first image I remember from that day was Marianne placing the authentic memorial coin beneath a small light in the entryway. The dent under the eagle's wing caught the glow. The counterfeit coin remained in an evidence locker. Malcolm had copied the appearance and missed the flaw. In the end, the flaw was what proved which one belonged. The second image was a man named Leonard Price standing in front of the first cottage with a key in his hand. Leonard had served as an army mechanic. After his wife died and medical bills consumed their savings, he spent 11 months moving between a nephew's sofa, a weekly motel, and his truck. He did not make a speech. He opened the door. Inside waited a brown recliner, a clean kitchen, and a workbench donated by students from the technical college. Leonard ran one hand across the bench and looked away until he could speak. "Feels level," he said. "I checked it twice," I told him. He smiled. "Knew you would." The third image came after the crowd thinned. Marianne asked Claire and me to walk with her to Leonard's porch. A small brass plaque had been mounted beside the light. I assumed it carried Eli's name. It carried his handwriting. Marianne had found the sentence on the back of an old birthday card in the blue binder. Eli had written it years before he joined the Guard, after one of my late returns from annual training. Mom leaves the porch light on. Dad checks the lock twice. I guess a good home needs both. I read it once. Then again. For years, Marianne and I had treated our differences as evidence that one of us understood love and the other did not. Eli had seen the same differences and called them home. That was the warmest surprise Peter ever gave us, although he never intended it. By trying to turn our weaknesses into weapons, he forced us to look at what those traits had been before grief hardened them. Marianne's trust had once welcomed people. My caution had once kept them safe. Either quality without the other could be exploited. Together, under better boundaries, they could still build something useful. Leonard stepped outside and switched on the porch light, even though the sun had not set. "Wanted to make sure it works," he said. Marianne laughed. I looked at her across the porch. There was no invitation in the look and no regret disguised as one. We were not husband and wife. We were not enemies. We were two people who had survived the collapse of a marriage, the theft of a story, and the temptation to make being right more important than doing right. People later asked whether I regretted staying quiet at the wedding. I regret parts of it. I regret that my marriage had become so damaged that a clear warning from me would have sounded like possession. I regret taking private satisfaction in knowledge I could not share. I regret not finding a plainer way to urge an independent review before the forged papers appeared. I do not regret protecting restricted information. I do not regret reporting Peter through the proper channel. I do not regret refusing to give him the public outburst he had designed my invitation to produce. Silence by itself is not strength. Sometimes it is fear, sometimes it is pride, sometimes it is abandonment wearing a calm face. The silence that mattered in my story was paired with action. A secure report, a saved napkin, public tax returns, original donor letters, a bank affidavit, a daughter who asked one more question, a former wife who opened a binder before signing her name. Records gave truth enough weight to arrive without my anger carrying it. Peter believed he could make the same thing exist in two places, a false veteran and a trusted advocate, a private thief and a public builder, a counterfeit coin and a family legacy. That trick works until someone checks the shelf. The sun lowered behind the cottages. One porch light came on, then another as volunteers tested them. Warm squares appeared across the property where empty ground had been. Marianne stood beside Claire. I stood on the other side of the walk. Leonard closed his front door from the inside. For the first time in a long while, none of us were waiting for someone to come home. We were watching someone realize he already had